Hi guys, today we're going to be discussing neurobiology of trauma and sexual assault. We're going to be introducing the basic elements of neurobiology, parts of the brain that are affected in traumatic situations such as sexual assault. We'll be learning about the drastic survival reflexes and the relationship between assault and memory. So there's 4 lessons here. We're going to go over brain circuitry, reactions in traumatic situations, drastic survival reflexes during a sexual assault, and the roles of brain circuitries in trauma, healing, and memory. So by the end of this, hopefully you will be able to describe the components of the brain related to trauma, some common ways that the brain is affected during and after a sexual assault, be able to recognize some of the common ways a traumatic experience can affect a victim's behavior. And also, finally, most importantly, you'll be able to assist a client or victim in understanding the neurobiology of trauma when it's appropriate, and we'll discuss that too. So feel free, if you'd like, you can stop this video to do what I'm doing, to go ahead and take out your worksheet 4.1. So this training is provided by the Office of Violence Against Women, and it's module 4 if you'd like to follow along. Sexual violence such as rape and sexual assault, it's almost always traumatic for our victims. The effects of trauma in the brain can be devastating and long-lasting, even into our later years. Most of us don't really understand what happens to the brain or inside the brain when an individual has been the victim of a trauma, such as sexual assault. In this module, we're going to be having an overview of what happens in the brain in a traumatic situation. The brain is truly a complex organ, and it's far too complex to go deep dive into this lecture. But we will be introducing some of the basic brain circuitries and structures and how they come into play during a traumatic experience. Some mental health professionals and agencies or entities may or may not agree with what we're discussing today. The neurobiology of trauma as scientific knowledge, models, and theories are rarely unanimously accepted, and sometimes it can even be politically divided. As a victim service provider, you should understand some of the basics of how trauma can affect emotions and behavior of victims of crime. So in particular, we'll be discussing the prefrontal cortex of the brain, key circuitries affected by trauma, emotional and brain responses when confronted with a traumatic situation, traumatic events and memory, as well as how we can use our knowledge to better help our clients. So the area of the slide within the yellow here is called the prefrontal cortex. It's a part of our brain that allows us to control or at least guide what happens in other parts of the brain. It's also how we process things like fear, emotion, and stress. The prefrontal cortex is a part of the brain that really makes us human. It helps hold thoughts and memories in mind and manages our emotions and helps us to reflect on things that has happened in the past, or maybe a behavior that we may have had in the past or presently. It carries out a lot of important functions in situations that are traumatic or not. And it permits a higher functioning and allows us to control what happens in other brain regions, such as the fear circuitry. Much of what we call the emotional part of the brain or the emotion brain, I've also heard it called defense circuitry. So this will directly and indirectly influence the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and other brain regions involved in emotion, stress reaction, reflexes, and impulsive behaviors. Now, under normal conditions, this allows us to focus our attention where we choose and do what we want. It's always consistent with our goals and our values. And we do this deliberately. It also allows us to do things that we are most conscious of, like reflecting on our emotions and deliberately directing our attention inward or outward. But the prefrontal cortex can be very impaired or even shut down during a traumatic event, such as a sexual assault. Brain is made up of circuitries connecting all different parts of the brain together. Now, whether or not they're near or far in the brain, they're all interconnected. We use the prefrontal cortex and many of its circuitries to both produce fear and regulate fear. Now, the fear circuitry plays a huge role in trauma and post-traumatic stress, as in the most cases of our clients, right? Fear is located in multiple areas of the brain, not just one. And the fear circuitry operates automatically and mostly outside of our awareness. Our brains can detect a reminder of trauma and generate an emotional response to it, and maybe a behavior, a fear behavior, before we even know what's happened. And sometimes without us even knowing that the response was triggered by a traumatic reminder. For example, a perpetrator of a sexual assault may have worn a yellow sweater, creating fear in the victim whenever he or she sees a yellow sweater. That the victim may not put two and two together later on, and every time they see a yellow sweater, they may start to have heart palpitations, and their brain just may start, or their body may start to produce stress signals. And we're going to get into that in just a moment. Although most trainings of neurobiology on trauma focus on fear and the defense circuitries, the brain circuitry of seeking is extremely important too. Whenever there's something that we fear, we also want to avoid that, right? We want to seek some type of escape. And often it's a quick fix. And unfortunately, it doesn't generally help us combat the larger problem. It doesn't solve anything. That's why you may have come across or encountered victims of sexual assault that may have substance abuse problems. When we sense fear, anxiety, sadness, or unwanted experiences, we want to avoid whatever is threatening. Our brains seek to escape. Now, this doesn't necessarily refer to something like craving or attachment, just escape. As with the fear circuitry, elements of this circuitry, the seeking circuitry, are not located in just one area of the brain, but they both help to both regulate this seeking and also produce it. This circuitry operates automatically and mostly outside of our awareness. Our brains can respond to unwanted feelings or experiences and generate seeking behavior, including addictive ones, without us realizing that we may have even developed an addictive behavior. At the same time, assault victims, no matter how badly they've been harmed, still seek to uphold their values and goals, even if their suffering and symptoms make it difficult. And this upholding of values is something that's very important to the brain seeking circuitry that is often overlooked. Not only does it seek addictive escapes, but it also seeks the very best in life and in human nature. Everything that we seek, whether it's alcohol, drugs, sex, money, praise, promotion, or upholding our highest values and goals, involves the brain's circuitry of seeking. Now, if people are striving to become the best versions of themselves, to achieve their goals, but they simply can't, it can become demoralizing. For example, for those in the military, the values of the military and the ideal of being a good soldier are extremely important. Or consider a mother or father who all they want in life is to be the best mother or the best father. But imagine that the PTSD symptoms are getting in the way of one's ability to do their job well or to parent well. Whatever our values are, we can't help but continuously ask ourselves, why aren't I achieving my goal? And we can become judgmental on ourselves based on how far or how close we are from our ideal self or reaching our goals. And when the answers are far away or moving away from our deepest values and the things that we feel are most important in life, we can become discouraged, demoralized, depressed. And this is something that a lot of traumatized people go through. Now, another brain circuitry we'll be discussing is circuitry of satisfaction. This produces a feeling of satisfaction when we get what we seek. So this is central to feeling soothed and safe in one's body, connected to other people, accepting a difficult experience. And not surprisingly, given that most people know about opiate drugs and how that they're powerful pain relievers, they also provide this blissed out feeling that people get from a drug called heroin. And it's a powerful synthetic opiate. And this circuitry involves opioid chemicals. So in this slide of the satisfaction circuitry, the purple dots correspond to places where the opioid receptors associated with satisfaction are found in the brain. And we have a lot more research being done. And if this is of interest to you, I would most certainly encourage you to look into that a little bit further. So again, this circuitry gives us the feeling of satisfaction that comes with getting what we seek. It's also critical to feelings of connection between parents and children, and satisfaction and connection between people in general. So it's central for people who are healing from trauma to feel soothed and safe in one's body. And we have the embodiment circuitry. This is the last circuitry we'll be discussing here. And it includes an area called the insular cortex, or the insula, and it's beneath all the other cortical areas. And it's an extremely important part of the brain. The insular cortex gets sensory data from all different parts of the body. If we direct our attention to the feeling of what's happening in our body, that it's the insular cortex that passes that information on to the prefrontal cortex, where we can notice, reflect upon, and come to understand and accept what's happening in our body. Consequently, their circuitry is key to healing from trauma, addiction, depression, and many other issues or problems. This brain region receives information about what's happening in the body, including when people are experiencing emotions. It allows us to know what it feels like to be in our body moment to moment. Maybe some of you would refer to this as being present. It also can help survivors heal from trauma. And we're going to cover this a little bit later on too. So this insula allows us to be our embodied self. And it allows us to experience ourselves as a self in the body. That makes sense. So it's for our subjective experience to be grounded in our bodily sensations. This is different from being lost in your head or overly focused on thoughts, but cut off from the body experience. And it's also different from looking at your body objectively and thinking of how you want to change it, you know, by working out or something like that. The embodiment circuitry can come into play when the victim of a sexual assault has a drastic survival reflex during the attack. Now, most people who've gone through trauma, even though their brains and bodies are having intense fear and anxiety reactions, they're not paying attention to what's actually happening within the body. Instead, they have confusing thoughts about what the trauma means for them and their life, and what are the effects, including those reactions, mean in terms of the kind of person they are. So it's much more deep than some type of objective, you know, conscious thought process. Now, for understandable reasons we'll discuss later, most people who have been traumatized in the past aren't really making good use of this embodiment circuitry. Now, why do you think it is necessary for us to understand these brain circuitries? I'll just let you think about that a little bit, and then we'll go ahead and move on to the next. Hi guys, next up we're going to be discussing reactions in traumatic situations. Now, generally when people discuss trauma and the brain, the first thing you'll really hear people talk about is the amygdala. It's one of the most important regions in our brain during a traumatic event. And if you look at the screen, you'll notice that the big arrows are the biggest, or the arrows that are the biggest are coming from the amygdala. Its most central and powerful role in coordinating the brain's response to or enduring a traumatic experience. And we'll talk about how the amygdala determines what you pay attention to during a traumatic experience a little bit later. We'll also be discussing how it triggers an emotional response as well. But for now, the key points is that while there's a lot more data and science coming out, for now we're just going to be, I just want you to know that the amygdala controls the brain in traumatic situations, right? That during traumatic experiences, there's a loss of the prefrontal cortex regulation, and that most of the brain's responses happen automatically and outside of our awareness. Okay. Now, the fear circuitry, especially the amygdala, causes several things to happen. First is loss of prefrontal cortex. Chemicals from the brain stem impair the prefrontal cortex. And it's got bottom-up attention, what we were talking about before. Attention is automatically captured by anything that is perceived as dangerous or life-threatening, something that's needed to survive. And emotional reflexes. You know, this is the flight, fright. I always get this mixed up. Fight, flight, or freeze, right? Responses that we talk about as well, and as well as other bodily responses like your heart pounding quickly. Now I want you to take a deep breath with me, close your eyes, and open them. Okay, where did your attention go? Well, For most people, it was the knife. Now, I know that some people will say if they're going through a lot of presentations or in their class with me, then their prefrontal cortex is already working, right? But for general people, their attention goes to the knife. Why? It was your amygdala. It wasn't your prefrontal cortex that automatically put your attention on the knife. That's that's exactly what's happening during a sexual assault. From the moment the fear kicks in, the fear circuitry, not the prefrontal cortex, is mostly and entirely determining where your attention to. Now, attention can latch on to things that in the moment the fear circuitry determined are critical for survival. For example, during an attack, a victim might focus on a picture of on the wall or something inconsequential, right? Something on the ceiling. And this is to help the person escape from the bodily sensations that is happening, right? And later on, they may look back at that situation. And I mean, even other people, including loved ones, investigators, prosecutors, judges, juries, they may not understand why that person focused on something so inconsequential. The point is, we have no right to second guess what the fear circuitry focused attention on amidst the assault, thus what is encoded into the memory. That's just how the human brains are wired to respond to being attacked, and it's based on hundreds and millions of years of evolution, right? And it's not just in the human species, but in different types of mammals. Now, what happens when we encounter a dangerous situation and the amygdala and fear circuitry trigger survival reflexes in the body? One, pupils dilate. It lets in more light and it sharpens our vision. Our heart beats faster and it pumps more blood. Blood pressure increases. Breathing rate increases to supply more oxygen to the body. And then that increased blood flow is sent to the muscles away from the internal organs. All of this lets us do things that in any other circumstance, we wouldn't really be able to do, because we want to be able to survive what we perceive as a life-threatening experience, such as encountering a predator. Fight or flight is misleading, and it gets in the way of how we understand how human brains are wired to respond to trauma. That phrase seems to indicate that if we were brave enough, if we were a real man, if we were a true soldier, if we were a good parent, right, he or she would have reacted to an assault by fighting back. And that only a coward, say, would try to escape. But that's simply not how our brains are wired. We evolved first to freeze, then to flee. Even if humans do fight when attacked by a predator, it's not because they want to win the fight. They react as if they're like a caged animal. We evolved knowing that if we fight a big predator with menacing jaws and sharp teeth or claws, that we're going to lose. And the same applies when the predator has a gun or is carrying a knife or has some other type of threat. It could even be something like if that person has a powerful position, okay? Sometimes an assault victim may fight back, but it is extremely unusual. It's very important that the victim and we ourselves who work with victims know that they may feel ashamed about what they didn't or did do during the assault. Many people, when they look back on the assault, think, why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I run? Okay. But we have incorrect expectations of how our brains work. And unfortunately, even after we've experienced something like this, our family and friends still may not get it. And more unfortunately, I'll say that a lot of investigators and police officers even haven't been able to really let this type of knowledge sink in. So freeze reactions usually happen at the beginning of the trauma, at the onset. It's a brief response. It's a brief response during the first perception of danger, and it's somebody is going to be high alert and having a heightened attentional state that's receptive to a wide array of information in the external environment. They're not moving because that could provoke or worsen the attack, and they're ready to just suddenly burst into action. Now, all of us have been in a situation where we froze. Many of these are not traumatic situations, but they're just simply frightening. Being approached by a vicious dog, say, or I know that I've talked with my class about the time a police officer drove up and I ran away and my friend froze, right? We all react to trauma a little differently, but our brains first are freezing, right? And no matter how much we wish we could go back and change things, it's just a part of how our brains work. So I'll allow you to kind of sit and think about that for a minute, and I'll go ahead and see you next time. We'll be discussing module 3, or not module 3, just the next lesson. Hey guys, so we're going to be discussing drastic survival reflexes during sexual assault. During the initial freeze response at any time during an assault, their prefrontal cortex will be affected. It's going to impair the rational thought process, and it's the brain's fear circuitry that may automatically determine that escape is or is not possible. And even though the victim wants to escape, their survival instincts may kick in, right, or are kicking in, but they may be just perceiving that there's no escape in sight. Now, when this happens, the escape is perceived as impossible. The fear circuitry can trigger some survival reflexes, and it's important that we're aware of these so that when somebody is discussing something that's happened or they wish they could go back and do things differently, we have a little bit of knowledge in neurobiology of trauma to help them understand and validate their experience. Now, one of these automatic survival reflexes over which the victim has no control is called disassociation. Now, this involves a disconnection from emotions and even sensations that's happening in the body. It includes an experience such as feeling like what's happening is unreal, or like things are just in a movie, or sometimes things are happening in slow motion, or there's a fog. It's a feeling of being disconnected from your body. And the quote here is from a participant in a research study that was conducted when she was asked about sexual assault that occurred many years prior. And she had said that it was silence, looking at her through a glass wall. So it couldn't affect me. It couldn't touch me. Now there's a lot more data coming out about the biology of disassociation during trauma. But for now, we know that there's definitely evidence that disassociation involves altered functioning of the embodiment circuitry and or disconnection between the embodiment circuitry and the prefrontal cortex. And this fits with a lot of our survivors' experiences of lacking awareness of bodily sensations, of physical contact involved in the assault, and also bodily sensations associated with the emotions that's happening as the emotions with the emotions the assault was triggering. Now, when a victim experiences disassociation, a lot of people say that they feel like they're spaced out. You know, they're not really a part of what's happening, or they're disconnected from the emotions in their body as though it was they were watching a movie, or that they were on autopilot, and somebody will go through the motions of what's happening without any sense of control or choice. And only later will they realize that they may have done things that they never consciously intended to do. Now, this can mean participating in sex acts, not because the victim chose to, let alone consented or wanted to, but because they were so they were in this terrified disassociative state. Okay. Now, this is a common response also for people who had been sexually abused as children. And it can be something that another sexual assault or even just a sexual experience can be triggered, can trigger disassociation. Now, it's also a huge source of shame for our clients. They may be upset with themselves for what other people will say she did or he did, even though I mean, it may look like they're actively participating, but they're not. They're just terrified. Right? So you can only imagine. And in addition to that, I mean, if somebody's going through the justice system and they've got investigators and judges, right, they may misinterpret this survival reflex and many of the other survival reflexes we're about to talk about. So it is critical for us to help our clients who disassociated during an assault know that this is just a brain-based automatic response, right? Now, another drastic survival reflex is called tonic immobility. This is a brain-based response that is over 300 million years old. Okay, it's found in birds and sharks and many other mammals. Now, the chicken that's shown here is in a state of tonic immobility. And you'll see that its legs and his neck are rigid, right? And what had happened is somebody had just restrained the chicken. Okay, now if somebody were to hit its feet or its head, it would barely move. Tonic immobility is different from freezing, where movement is possible, but they're not engaged in, it's not engaged in it while they're assessing and avoiding an even more dangerous attack. With tonic immobility, the victim is actually paralyzed. They're unable to move, unable to speak, unable to cry out as much as they yearn or want to do so. Like disassociation, with which it may overlap, tonic immobility happens when escape appears to be impossible. It's also understood as a last-ditch effort, and it happens in some of the more extreme versions of the body shutting down in the face of an overwhelming threat or trauma. And there's an estimate of 10 to 50% of victims will experience tonic immobility to some extent in trauma in general, whether it's sexual or non-sexual. The onset of tonic immobility is sudden, and it's usually after a failed struggle. It also can terminate suddenly. This reflex can last from seconds to hours, and this drastic survival reflex doesn't impair alertness or memory encoding. So it can look like somebody who's trembling or shaking. They could have stiff muscles or rigid muscles. They could feel cold or numb to pain. And they can have this fixed or unfocused staring or an intermittent eye closure. So they're just good things to know. So if a client is discussing, you know, what they remember, and you can remember some of these, let them know. It's just a survival reflex. Now, another reflex is called collapsed immobility. It's different from tonic immobility and disassociation. This results from a massive input into the heart from the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And this causes an extreme decrease in the heart rate and blood pressure, which can cause things like sleepiness or faintness or loss of consciousness. Some people who have collapsed immobility will also may have collapsed immobility, like when they see something like a sharp object or a I'm trying to think of like when somebody's getting a shot, right, or somebody's getting blood. Somebody with this collapsed immobility may have like they may pass out, right? That's what I mean. Oh, okay. So this possum on the screen, if you were to pick up this possum, he would be limp and floppy. Okay. He wouldn't be rigid like the chicken was. So this is just a different survival reflex. Now, it's often accompanied by experience of mental defeat, feeling completely and totally helpless. And it can be, like I said, it can also be triggered by things like seeing blood or something like that. Now, evidence suggests that collapsed immobility is more likely to happen for those people who see blood or faint from, you know, if they have a blood phobia. And it's also more likely to happen in women more than men, ironically. Also, there's a significant percentage of animals who resort to tonic immobility or collapsed immobility when they're attacked by a predator. Collapsed immobility is not as common as tonic immobility, but it's not uncommon either. This can be a source of a lot of shame and confusion for our clients who will look back and think of what they could have done or should have done or fought back. And it can be also disturbing to family and friends, you know, as well as other people who are reviewing the case and trying to help them through this. And at the end of the day, when people aren't believing our survivors, this confusion about why they didn't do something, you know, or act a certain way, it can lead to a lot of doubt and blaming oneself and shaming victims. So again, it's extremely important that we understand these different reflexes and we help our clients understand that they're normal brain-based responses that are rooted in hundreds of millions of years of evolution, and it's just how our brains are wired. So we and our clients are often told by other people that victims will report a behavior during an assault that just doesn't make sense. And here we have 4 major responses that police investigators, judges, prosecutors will actually use against the person who has finally come forward about an assault, right? And this is all to doubt that the victim didn't consent. right? Because that person didn't resist. Or why didn't you attempt to escape? Nobody heard you scream, or they were an active participant. Defense attorney try to use these brain-based trauma responses to undermine the credibility of the victim by describing these as evidence of consent. And I will just say that if you're looking to do this long term, that this comes up a lot and it can be really frustrating. I mean, even me now, I'm like thinking about situations where that's happened with my clients and I'm getting kind of worked up or frustrated. Okay. And the next one. So it's you know, it's not only unfortunate because somebody isn't getting the justice that they need, but oftentimes it's situations like this that will break somebody's confidence down so low that they recant their statement. And I have had a question from a student who asked, why do people who recant or take back their statement of a sexual assault, why don't they get in trouble? Well, it's because of situations like this, right? Somebody may start to doubt themselves, or they're not able to retell the story in a precise way. They feel like a coward. They get discouraged and depressed. This is a really difficult process. So understanding the neurobiology of the brain during and after sexual assault is very important for us to really truly understand. Now we know like these responses make perfect sense. And if as an advocate who's learned that these are completely normal, and to be able to to name, right, what that person went through, right, did they have disassociation, tonic immobility, collapsed mobility, right? Putting a name to these things will really help the survivor feel validated and like they can move forward, because they will know within their minds, right, heart, mind, and soul, whatever, that they did what they could do with the information they had at the time, right? And it's not their fault that they didn't do something more. So I think even if the victim isn't ready to receive, you know, neurobiology of rape trauma, it allows us to have more conviction when we say it wasn't your fault and we believe you. Now, on the screen, you'll see on the left side is the brain of a perpetrator, and on the right side is the brain of the victim. And you'll see that on the side of the perpetrator, the prefrontal cortex is completely in control. Okay, the big arrows are controlling the rest of the brain. And in the victim, it's controlled by the amygdala. Okay, so the perpetrator is thinking clearly. They're able to carry out their planned sexual assault, or they're able to use their prefrontal cortex to direct and modify their assaultive behaviors. Okay, they may be habitual behaviors or practiced behaviors, right? But they're in complete control. Now, for the victim, the fear circuitry has kicked in. They're terrified and overwhelmed, and their thoughts are driven by the perpetrator's actions. The behaviors are controlled by the emotional reflexes and sometimes partly by habitual responses to aggression that first developed when they were a child. So this is a great place to end. And I want you guys to go ahead and go back and take out that worksheet 4.1 and go over the response scenario case study. One is about Kevin. He's a 12-year-old who's been bullied and sexually assaulted. And I'm going to have a little bit more instruction for you about that on Canva. And then another is about a woman named Gabriel who is going through a trial with her rapist. And then the other is Bella. She's a single mother with 3 children, who I think she was robbed and sexually assaulted. So go through those scenarios and answer the questions, and yeah, look for further instruction in the assignments. The fourth lesson that we'll have today is roles of circuitries in trauma, memory, and healing. So what happens to our brain, or what happens to our memory during a traumatic situation? Why are some victims, or why are some clients unable to recall what happened, or why do they remember some things and not others? Well, during trauma, the brain releases high amounts of stress chemicals, and the amygdala is also very active, right? And there's strong encoding of emotional and sensory memories. The prefrontal cortex is impaired, right? And we discussed this quite a bit. But this also includes the language production area. The hippocampus also is altered, and this means that the context of the assault and the events that happen can be poorly woven into a whole, right? Into a big picture of what happened. The sequence of the events are going to be poorly encoded, but it's the emotional memories that are actually encoded very well. Especially for experiences surrounding like the onset of fear or terror. Like when the victim realized that he or she was going to be sexually assaulted. Unfortunately, victims themselves, oh, I'm sorry. What we pay attention to largely determines yeah. Oh, we just went over this. Okay, great. Okay, here we go. What we pay attention to largely determines what gets encoded into our memory, right? During states of fear or distress, where the prefrontal cortex is impaired and the attention is determined by the fear circuitry, it has a bottom-up attention, right? And it attaches onto specific stimuli. And when this happens, there's much less encoding of more complex contextual information, right? Like how objects are arranged in a room, or even events and sequences of the sequence of event over a period of time, right? How did you get there? How did you leave? What happened before? What happened after? So knowing this can really help us to understand why memories are often fragmented or there's missing information about, you know, where were you? What did the room look like? Now, even though the client, others like the investigator, may believe the victim, like, well, you would have had to remember this bright blue painting in the room, right? But in the midst of a traumatic assault, right, the victims just simply not noticing that type of information. Now, for all the reason that we've covered so far, memories of sexual assault tend to be fragmentary. Images, sounds, and body and other sensations, right? As well as strong emotions like disgust. Now, traumatic memories have few peripheral details, okay? Now, just these are things that are given little attention to during when things are getting encoded into the brain. Now, this is especially happens right after an assault has occurred. Now, like if you think about it, when somebody is meeting with an investigator or a prosecutor, or they have to testify in court, a lot of these feelings are going to be triggered. Now, they may not remember the blue painting on the wall, but they'll remember how it made them feel. Now, if you can just imagine, right, how that may make somebody look, right, to other people who don't understand what's happening or what's happened in the brain, and what kind of judgments may be cast upon them, and the type of triggers that may come up when people aren't being, maybe the person that's talking to the victim, right, may not believe that this has happened, and that can trigger things as well. We're going to get into that in a second. Okay. So the combination of the fear circuitry control and the impairment of the prefrontal cortex leads to a bottom-up attention, right? Things are automatically captured or focused on that's perceived as dangerous, threatening, or essential to survive, right? Or coping, right? What things are people paying attention to in order to cope with what's happening to their body, right? The circuitry and the stress hormones change the way that the hippocampus functions, right? It's a key structure for encoding memories, and it's responsible for weaving together the details and context of time. So during a traumatic experience, when this is altered, it decreases the encoding of most of what's happening, especially with time. Okay. Now, the focus on danger from bottom up also and the altered hippocampus cause the victim to have memories to be fragmented. Okay, so memories retrieved can be unpredictable, incomplete, or disorganized. But some aspects are often recalled accurately, like the onset of fear or essential details, or the survival reflexes, like we said, before and after, like the onset of terror, and other what we call islands of memory. Now, in these islands of memory, the micro islands contain fragmentary sensations, and the larger islands contain key periods of memory during the assault. Now, these key periods include when fear kicks in. It's usually right before, during, and after the onset. And for that initial phase, the context and time sequence information very well may be encoded, especially if it seemed like things were happening in slow motion. It's when you're more likely to get that, okay? And these islands also contain memory that were part of the survival reflex. The freezing, the dissociation, the tonic immobility, the collapsed immobility, or the shift from one state to another, okay? Maybe moving from feeling dizzy to passing out, right? Just like this transition, right? Now, of course, in addition to the assault itself, things like alcohol and drugs will also create issues for encoding the memory. A low to moderate dose or level of intoxication will impair the ability of the person to be able to encode the context of the situation, but it doesn't impair the coding of sensations. Now, a high dose of intoxication, right? Especially like if somebody goes into a blackout, you may not get any type of information from that person. The victim will remember nothing. Right? We say, what is the most commonly used drug for a rape? Okay. Now, the state of the brain at the time of experiencing will also affect what's encoded and what kind of things that the person can bring back up when they're being questioned. So if a client feels unsafe and judged, for example, by a police officer or investigator who doesn't understand the impacts of sexual assault or doesn't believe the victim, then literally their prefrontal cortex may shut down and they may not be able to even understand the question in order to retrieve the information that investigator needs. Now, we want to have that the client should be able to talk to the investigator, right? I mean, should. We don't use should ever in sexual assault case, but that is one of the reasons why an advocate will accompany somebody to go ahead and give their statement because of this traumatization and questioning that often happens. So you know, having somebody there who believes them and is reassuring and gives them that sense of comfort and support is really going to be right the big difference in whether or not this person is prosecuted correctly, because a jury or a judge just may see this as somebody who has you know, their story doesn't make sense and it looked like they wanted to be there. So it's important for not only the victim but also the like the DA's office, right? It's better for society that an advocate is present to help them tell their story in the best in the best way that they can. Also, if the victim is being traumatized by remembering what has happened, right, this may trigger automatic retrieval in a bottom-up way of fragmentary sensations and emotions that could feel as intense as the assault itself. So it's like a re-traumatization. Okay. Even under the best conditions, somebody who's been assaulted is likely to have a hard time putting the fragments that they can remember into words, let alone a coherent story. So to make things even more complex, someone may remember in a disassociated way. And this could be how they experienced the trauma in the first place. And that involves its own impairments and problems. For example, the more disassociated someone is, the less active their embodiment circuitry tends to be. And the less the memory feels real or true or valid to them. And this can be contagious. So if somebody is telling the story of how they were sexually assaulted, but it sounds like they're reading from a grocery list, then the person listening to them, it's going to be a lot more difficult for that person to understand that this is just, you know, the way that brains respond to trauma. If you're reading like it's a grocery list, the other person may not believe you or believe the client. So, yes. Now, because of the language areas being impaired in the brain during assault, they may even shut down. The memory may have few words, or that may have no narrative at all. So at least at first, before the person begins healing. And once a person begins to heal, sometimes they'll be able to add more words and make more sense of what had happened, even if it's still incomplete. So traumatic memories are often associated with powerful emotions with little or no language. Therefore, later on, when somebody is trying to remember the trauma, they may have trouble, right? But memories can pop up, maybe out of nowhere, maybe when they don't expect them to or want them to, right? Also, because of the associative nature of memory and the strength of associations made during the trauma, all kinds of things can become a trigger for them for the rest of their life, okay? So it could be like if somebody had thick eyebrows, every time that person sees the thick eyebrows, they're going to get triggered, right? It could be an angry or a threatening tone of voice. Maybe it could be the color of the walls in a room where the assault took place. All of these things can trigger remembering, right? Including the emotional responses that are linked to it. So in short, life can become a minefield of potential trauma memory triggers. Now, when you have some knowledge about just how profoundly neurobiology affects the victim's trauma or contributes to it, you'll have a much better understanding of why people respond the way that they do, why their memories may be fragmented or incomplete, why they may have appeared to be cooperating during the assault, or why other behaviors, which at first may seem like they make no sense, are actually completely normal. You'll understand why it's very important for the client to feel safe when they're talking about this experience and understood as having responses and memories that totally make sense. Your empathy for the client will empower them in more ways than I can count. The more safe the person feels, the more cooperative and able to remember and more willing to report they will be. So our deeper understanding of these experiences of a victim is going to make it a lot easier also for us to be able to determine what they need physically, psychologically, and to assist them in court and in meetings with the prosecutor if they do choose to report. So there's another activity, and it's called How Would You Respond? And it's in your manual there. So just go ahead, and I'm actually going to have you guys just pick like three of those, and then I'll go ahead and put it in the assignment. Don't worry about it. So at the end, you should be able to describe the basic components of the brain related to trauma, explain some of the common ways that the brain is affected during and after sexual assault, recognize some of the common ways that traumatic experiences can affect a victim's behavior, and also to assist a victim in understanding the neurobiology of trauma when it's appropriate, of course. And of course, if you have any questions, please go ahead and email me. If you put them in the comment section, I don't always see that. So this training specifically really helped me personally have a lot of validation for what happened to me when I was 16 years old. I didn't really have the language or insight, or I didn't tell anybody about it until I was in college. So and it wasn't until I was in my career that I actually was exposed to neurobiology of sexual assault, right? So having this information will help you, it'll help others, and it'll help you be more you know, confident in absolutely understanding that it was not their fault, that we do believe the survivor, that they're not alone, and now you get to help them. So I hope you enjoyed this. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.